Hello, everyone. We are today starting a new unit, and that is on American imperialism. And if you look at this map, you can see that there is one single year listed at the top. And prior to 1898, the United States was just the continent. But in one single year, it's going to stretch 10,000 miles from tip to tip, as this cartoon shows, with acquisitions in the Caribbean as well as all the way over to the Philippines and throughout the Pacific Ocean. Before we get started, I have a disclaimer to kind of tell you about because a lot of what I've taken from the following slides, as well as throughout this unit, is going to come from this book. And it's called The Imperial Cruise by James Bradley. He's the same guy that wrote the Flags of Our Fathers, as well as Flyboys. And it's a really interesting story or book that I read several years ago, in which it documents the experience with the Philippines and the Spanish American War. And this cruise was a real cruise that happened where Teddy Roosevelt sent his daughter Alice, who at one point Alice was pretty strong-willed. And at one point he said, I can either control Alice or I can work with the country. I can't do both because she was so headstrong. And so he sends her on this cruise with William Howard Taft, who will be his successor. And they go over to Asia. And this book documents the views of Americans at the time. And some of the things that I learned were very shocking to me. They seemed extremely racist to us in the 21st century, but they were mainstream at the time. And I'm going to show a little bit of how that was. And so I really want you to understand that sometimes when we look at history, we have to take off our 2020 glasses. We have to take off the blinders that put us being able to look at the past and say, how on earth could they have done that? Because as I said, some of these things were extremely racist in their views of the Filipinos, of Hawaiians, etc., just as they will be of Native Americans during the continental expansion. And so I wanted you to be aware that these are not his views. They're not the teacher's views. They're actual views of people that existed during that time. And I think it's really important for us to, in 2020, acknowledge that white supremacy is not okay, that what they did to the Filipinos and the Hawaiians and how they treated them is not okay. But at the same time, to understand the time in which this occurred, things were much different. And so we acknowledge history. And to me, history really needs to be the good, the bad, and the ugly, that we share everything that we have done as a country so that we can learn from the past, so that we can move forward and we can look at it and say, okay, we've come a long way. And then at other times say, you know what, we've been in the same situation before. Let's look at what we did in the past so that we can make good choices now and in the future. And that's exactly what this unit on imperialism allows us to do, is really to dive into what they did, why they did it, and then to bring it forward to now and to look at the current world and maybe even future events in terms of that lens and have that ability to look back and to make new choices. Moving on, we have three imperialist presidents. We have William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft. William McKinley will become president in 1896. We talked about this before when we talked about the Populist Party. He will be assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt will take his place. When he becomes president, he is the youngest president we've ever had. He was he will be part of the Spanish American War as a Rough Rider. He leads that group. So he's a military guy. And then William Howard Taft, after Theodore Roosevelt as president, is going to continue on. And he has a unique fact about him, is that he is the only president who then later on will also become a Supreme Court justice. So those are the three men during this time period that we're talking about. Theodore Roosevelt said, our future history will be more determined by our position on the Pacific facing China than by our position on the Atlantic facing Europe. And when he said this, it was really profound, considering that today, really, most of our trade, most of our focus is on the Pacific, particularly on China, but we also do trade with a lot of other nations. We know that so much of the focus during World War II and beyond has been in Asia. And if you look at this map here, you can see the light yellow was the United States at the time, and then the kind of orangish yellow was areas that we had acquired and we possessed. And then we also had U.S. protectorates. So notice that Cuba was a protectorate, Nicaragua was a protectorate, Panama, which we'll get into another lesson, and the Dominican Republic were all protectorates during that time. But then we also had the acquisitions of the Philippines was part of the United States, and other places that are still today part of the United States. So he was very forward thinking in this idea that China and the Pacific would be really where our influence and some of our headaches would come from. Arguments for expansion. So these are really the causes of US imperialism. And I really prefer to use the idea of the three G's: gold, God, and glory. And I'm going to show you how that works. So gold, obviously being money and value in items. And so one of them is to expand our business interests. The US economy had been doing pretty well, but then there's going to be some new panics, new depressions that are going to facilitate the desire to find overseas factories, overseas new markets, raw materials, and all of that to prevent the future panics from happening. So that's the gold part of it. And then when we talk about God, the next two, this idea of social Darwinism. You probably have heard of Darwin and the idea of survival of the fittest, that those species that are best adapted are the ones that will survive, while those that are the weakest will not. And social Darwinism was a term that we used in the Gilded Age as well, where businessmen and billionaires justified their wealth because they worked hard. And so it's going to expand here, where the US must continue to expand to survive. We'll get part of the rationale for that in a minute. The idea of what racial superiority was certainly something that came up then, and it goes with this idea of spreading Christianity too. There was this belief in the need to expand Christianity everywhere else, and that whatever religion people had to begin with was not acceptable, that they were considered to be backward, savage, just in a large part the way that they looked at Native Americans and the need to Christianize and civilize them. They're going to do the same thing with the Filipinos and with the Native Hawaiians, et cetera. And so racial superiority is a huge part of the driving factor. And so that part is the God part. And then glory also is the idea of expanding our interests, both for power as well as for glory. I'm going to come back in a minute and talk about how the American frontier is closed and what I mean by that, but also there's a desire for military interest and the need for coaling stations. We are going to fund battleships, etc. So this is a cartoon that shows you about the expansion that America has done by the time we get to when our story is occurring. So in 1783, we're this little tiny country. We're just a baby with our 13 states. And then by 1803, when we acquire Louisiana Purchase, is when we're now getting to be maybe a teenager or a preteen at the worst. And then by 1819, we have 22 states. We've acquired Florida, and the union's growing bigger. And then we're full grown by 1861 when we have 34 states. We're acquiring Texas. And then now we're becoming this bigger gentleman. Notice how his clothes are expanding at the same time. He's now not really getting much taller, but he's certainly enlarging with the acquisition and 48 states that we'll have by 1898. And this is the year that I showed you on that very first cartoon of 1898. Then in 1899, we will also acquire Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. And you can see now Uncle Sam is there ready. He's got his little ship, and I will talk in another lesson about the Great White Fleet and what that was. But now you can see at the end, here are all these nations, and we have Russia, Germany, Italy, Austria, England, France, and China at the bottom, it looks like. And these are all imperialist nations. And so they're reaching out their hand, welcoming Uncle Sam into the club. Now, to give you a historical context for imperialism, to understand why this time America decides she needs to gain territories, it's important to understand prior to this, we really had been isolationist in nature. And part of this had gone all the way back to when George Washington, in his farewell address, says that we need to beware of entangling alliances. And so we're going to keep ourselves politically separate from most of the world, with the exception of the war with Mexico that's going to happen in 1848. But now, towards the end of the 1800s, we are going to start to expand. Part of the rationale is because of Europe is imperializing. You had a unit on this in world history where you learned that England was out carving up different places and spheres of influence, including India. You also had the carving up of Africa with the scramble for Africa. And so America looks to this and says, wait a minute, if we want to be taken seriously, if we want to be on the same level as the rest of the world, then maybe we ought to get some colonies of our own. And that's just what they do. If you think back to manifest destiny, is the concept that America has the right and responsibility to expand to the Pacific Ocean. Well, that is going to drive America to not only once she gets to the Pacific Ocean, but then she's going to look overseas for additional territories to help fulfill this manifest destiny. As I previously mentioned, there's this idea of racial superiority, which again, I'm going to still come back to in a minute. At the time, there was this belief. Oh, actually, one thing I want to mention there was a study that were being done at the time called phrenology, which is now a defunct science. It is no longer accepted as mainstream or even legitimate. But the idea was of measuring the brains and the skulls actually of individuals. And the larger the skull, the more brain capacity it was believed to have, the more intellectual, the more superior that group was. And so they were doing studies to try to prove that certain individuals were less smart than others based on their race and ethnicity. And that was an accepted science that was being taught at places like Harvard University. And as I said, it's now defunct, but that played into racial superiority. There was also this idea of civilization follows the sun, and this myth that was perpetuated by individuals, including Theodore Roosevelt, and the idea that the civilization began in the East and it's spreading west. And you'll see cartoons that relate to this idea of the America is bringing civilization with her as she moves westward. There was also an economic depression that was happening in 1893 that caused people loss of jobs and everything. So it was something to potentially take their mind off this and look further west, and also the closing of the frontier, which I'll come back to in just a minute. And William Howard Taft, and this is where I told you at the very beginning that we have to look at the lens for what they said in terms of the fact that this was generally accepted at the time. William Howard Taft, who would become president and a Supreme Court justice, when he was referring to the Filipinos, said in many respects, nothing but grown-up children. They need the training of 50 or 100 years before they shall even realize what Anglo-Saxon liberty is. And he was using this quote in reference to whether or not the Filipinos should have self-government. All right, there are three really important books. We talked in the last unit about the jungle and how this portrayal of the meatpacking industry and the disgusting conditions that were there led to the passage of several acts. Well, there are three books here that also have extremely important influence upon imperialism. The first is The Frontier in American History by Frederick Jackson Turner, in which he talks about the fact that America had our history, our uniqueness has always been rooted in the idea of expanding and looking westward towards more land, and that now the frontier is closed. We need to continue looking overseas. Otherwise, who will we be? Because that's what makes America America. And we have this expanse of free land to the west and then ultimately over across the ocean. The second one is called Our Country, and it was by Reverend Josiah Strong. He was a congregational minister who wrote this book in 1885, and he claimed that Americans were a special, God-favored Anglo-Saxon race that served as the representatives of his quote, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization. And he also said that Americans had an instinct or genius for colonizing and should follow their destiny to lift up other societies. So, a few things in here. One of them, this idea that Americans were special, God-favored Anglo-Saxon race, is not new. It is not something that he addressed at that point. It goes all the way back to the founding of our country when John Winthrop famously said that Massachusetts Bay Colony would be a city upon a hill where others would look to us, that God favored us. And it's a theme today that continues to wind its way through American history and the American fabric. And that's the idea of American exceptionalism, that we have some special God favored status that and a unique gift that we should share with the rest of the world. And this idea that he also meant as far as this destiny to lift up other societies. That's a really important thing for you to understand, even though we look at it today as them basically forcing their beliefs and government and everything on these people, is that's not the way they looked at it. They looked at it as a very benevolent, helpful process that they were doing to lift up these other societies, that we have something wonderful to share with you and we'd like to do that. So it's not easy for us to judge them using our own modern beliefs. And then the third book is called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and that is by Alfred Thayer Mahan in 1890. And he said that the United States Navy should seize strategic ports that serve as links to international trade. He suggests the needs for links in the Pacific, which we will gain, a canal through Central America, and control of the Caribbean. So we ultimately won't have control of over the Caribbean, but we will certainly have influence, particularly in Cuba, for a period of time. And that is it for our introduction to imperialism. We're going to dive into many of the different events that include the Spanish American War as well as the Philippine American War. We will talk about America's acquisition of the Panama Canal Zone and its subsequent building of the Panama Canal, of how she was influential in many different disputes and things within Latin America. We will talk about how we acquired Hawaii, as well as our influence in Asia, particularly opening up Japan and China to colonization, not to colonization, but to new markets and trade. And so that is where I'm going to leave off for this one. Thank you for listening.